All right, so I just want to take a minute to acknowledge my collaborators, Tim Johnson, and who's an emeritus faculty in my department, Avenia Kapousus, who's was a graduate student until this year, who works at NORC at the University of Chicago now, and Henning Silber, who is at ASIS in Germany. Okay, so I think that was a fine introduction for me. You don't need to know anything else about me, actually. That was more information than I was going to provide. So this project is driven from the idea that public opinion surveys are a form of civic engagement. And there's research that suggests that willingness to participate in public opinion surveys correlates with other types of civic engagement. And I'm biased, but I think it's a particularly important form of civic engagement because it's one of the only ways that the opinions of a representative sample of a defined population can be obtained, right? So most forms of civic engagement rely on people to, they rely on motivation for people to, act, to express their opinion. Sometimes they require a lot of resources in order to engage in civic, in civic participation. But surveys are explicitly designed to derive or measure opinions and attitudes and beliefs and policy preferences from a representative sample of a defined population. And that means that it represents the perspectives that might not be represented in other forms of civic engagement. And we work very hard to make sure that our samples represent groups that are sort of typically underrepresented in the total process. In the world of doing public opinion surveys, there are a lot of concerns. And one of them has to do with reduced participation. So there's been a lot of papers written about how fewer and fewer people are going to participate in surveys, and that it takes more resources to get the same level of participation. So some really large surveys have continued to have high levels of participation, but they're overall spending more money and time to get that same level of participation. And the concern is that it increased the cost, but also the concern is that it reduces data quality. So it potentially reduces representativeness, and it also potentially reduces the effort that people put into answering surveys, right? So if they're more reluctant participants, maybe they're not answering the questions as carefully. And that's a lot of work that I do involves trying to write questions and trying to get respondents to answer survey questions carefully so that you get the highest quality data possible. One of the reasons for this is because there's increased contacts from non-surveys, sometimes disguised as surveys. And so we all are contacted many times about sales things. In particular, organizations like the American Association for Public Opinion Research, which is a big national professional organization of people who do surveys of public opinion research, condemns the practices of sugging and frugging, which are fun names. But sugging is essentially sales under the guise of surveys, and frugging is fundraising under the guise of surveys. So if you've ever answered the phone and someone says, I'm calling from so-and-so and I'd like to do a survey with you, but at the end of that process they either try to sell you something or they try to get you to give money to something, that is a practice that this organization condemns, in part because it makes people mistrustful of survey requests. And so all of this has led to an interest in people's beliefs, knowledge, and attitudes towards surveys. What predicts positive evaluations of surveys? Do positive evaluations of surveys lead people to be more willing to participate? What predicts knowledge about surveys, and is knowledge even important? So one of the points of concern that people in this community have is to say, do people understand surveys? Can they tell the difference between a high-quality survey and a not-so-high-quality survey? And how do people determine whether a specific survey is accurate or not? So this is relevant to a lot of different literatures. It's relevant to the literature on civic engagement. I've talked a little bit about that. It's relevant to literatures in a field called public understanding of science, because surveys are essentially a form, not essentially, they are a form of social science. And so understanding things like what a representative sample means, understanding probability sampling, and all of those things impact people don't necessarily understand them. And so it's, that's been an area of study, is sort of what do people know about surveys and how do they use that knowledge to evaluate surveys. And then we've also tied some of our work to the persuasion literature on dual processing models. where we know that people process information about surveys in this case, both peripherally and centrally, and when they do each and what is the consequence for their perception. So we've linked to that literature as well. So looking at some past studies, citizens and elites both believe that surveys should be used in the democratic process, elites slightly more, and Democrats more than Republicans. Attitudes towards surveys do impact willingness to participate, so that answers sort of one question. There's a 9-item scale that was created by Edith DeLue and her colleagues in the Netherlands, and they have shown pretty compellingly that that scale does predict willingness to participate in surveys. And then vignette studies, vignettes are little brief descriptions of, in this case, surveys, their methodology and findings, that vary aspects of survey methodology and the results of the survey for a hypothetical survey have shown what kinds of things people use to evaluate the result of a specific survey. So these studies are designed to answer a question about when you read about a paper in the New York, or a survey, sorry, in the New York Times, and you read about the methodology and the result of the survey, how do you evaluate whether that survey is accurate or not? And not surprisingly, for those of us who are psychologists in the room, the single biggest direct predictor is whether or not the survey result is consistent with the person's own opinion on the topic being asked about. So the motivated reasoning literature says people are more critical of, going back to like Lord Rossenweaver, people are more critical of research studies that are inconsistent with their prior opinion. So that's kind of a big barrier, right? We would like people to be processing information about surveys objectively, but we know that they do it in a biased way as soon as you tell them what the results of the survey are. But reassuringly, I guess, I don't know, from my perspective, because I think people should evaluate the methodology very objectively and be able to do that, there is some evidence that people use methodological information when they're motivated and able. And so the last part of my presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about some vignette studies that we did, and what factors predicted when people use methodological information. And hopefully in the discussion, in the Q&A, I'd like to talk and get your input on sort of what could we create a program or a treatment that would help people to think more objectively about surveys, if that's the sort of the end goal, and what would that look like. So the current research, we wanted to undertake a broader mixed method approach to examining public perceptions of public opinion surveys. And actually, I should go back to this and say the Edith DeLue work is fairly recent, but some of this work, even though it has, a lot of it is very old, right? So there's not a lot of work. Some of this involves analysis of data that's 30 or 40 years old. So what we want to do is undertake a broader mixed method approach to examining public perceptions of public opinion surveys. And we did so using a study where we conducted online focus groups, and then 2 web surveys of convenient samples, one where we used MTurk and one where we used Prolific. I'm not going to talk at all about this in this presentation, but if you want to know why we switched from MTurk to Prolific, I could literally give you an hour-long presentation on that, because it was a very memorable experience. We learned a lot about MTurk, and then we learned about why we don't want to use it in the future. Okay, and some of the challenges inherent in it. So our study that involved focus groups, we had 6 online focus groups with a total of 48 participants. They were 60 to 75 minutes long. We conducted these in November of 2022. And participants were stratified by age. 18 to 25, half of participants were 18 to 25, half were 26 or older, and we also stratified by gender. And in the introduction, it was mentioned the idea that we in most of our studies, we tried to oversample young respondents because we were really interested in whether or not there were differences across age, and again, because a lot of the literature is older. We haven't fully gotten into analyzing and comparing older and younger respondents, but that's sort of a direction for future research. So far, it doesn't look like there's a big difference in how older and younger respondents process information, but that we haven't completely finished analyzing that. So the focus groups were recorded and transcribed, and then one of the investigators did a thematic analysis. In the focus group, we talked about the definition of public opinion surveys. We asked people, what do you think public opinion surveys are? We asked about features of surveys that affect their quality and how they do so. We had kind of a general discussion about that. What kinds of things, when you read about a survey, what kinds of things affect your opinion, and we asked them about specific things. And then we also presented them with a vignette of a hypothetical survey and had a discussion of that. We talked about how public opinion surveys should In the first survey, it included 273 MTurk master workers that completed the survey between January 24th and March 12th of 2023. And these were stratified by gender. We intended to stratify by age, but we could not find a single MTurk master worker under the age of 26, which was one of the reasons that we moved to prolific for the third study. There were a number of issues with data quality, most of which I think we've addressed in terms of, but there was a lot of screening of this data in order to get responses from real people, honestly, I think, in this particular case. We did a lot of screening. So the average length of the survey took 14.83 minutes, and we measured their attitudes or evaluations of surveys, their behavior, their experience with surveys, and cognition, including beliefs about surveys and accuracy and knowledge about surveys. So I'm going to focus on these first two studies and look at two different questions. So what do people think is important for evaluating the accuracy of a survey? People have studied this via vignettes previously, but not directly via self-report. And I'm going to talk about the focus group in the survey, the first survey results of that, and then how do people use specific information about the survey to evaluate survey quality or accuracy. So how do we measure what people think is important? In the focus group, we asked people, do you think some public opinion surveys are better than others? And what makes a good or trustworthy public opinion survey better than a not-so-good survey or an untrustworthy public opinion survey? In the survey, we asked people how important are each of these aspects of the survey in evaluating the quality of a public opinion survey. And people gave their ratings on a fully labeled rating scale, and they chose between extremely important, very important, somewhat important, not very important, and not at all important. These were the things that the survey respondents reacted to and rated. And there's a bunch of things about the survey methodology. So how people were selected, the way the results are analyzed, the way they're reported, question wording, the organization that conducted the survey, the total number of people who participated, who funded the survey, how the data are collected, the response rate or the proportion of people who are asked to participate who agreed to complete the survey, and the number of days the organization spends collecting the data. These are all things that are associated with the quality of a survey. And then we had the survey results, whether you agree or disagree with the results, which remember in the vignette research, we know is the single biggest predictor of people's evaluations of surveys. And then we also included two irrelevant things because we didn't want people to just say, oh yes, everything is important, right? And so this was kind of a test of whether or not they were paying attention to some extent. So we included the number of siblings a researcher has and whether the participant has a dog. Both of which I think we can all in this room agree are not relevant or don't really reflect on survey quality. All right, so from the focus groups, the things that had the most mentions from focus group participants, the survey sponsor or organization that conducted the survey. And we had a really interesting discussion about people's perception. People definitely perceive certain organizations, university researchers, as being more trustworthy than media organizations, as being more trustworthy than, for example, an advocacy organization. They talked a lot about sort of bias versus objective sponsors and organizations who conducted the survey and how trustworthy they were. Some people also mentioned things like question wording and who is surveyed. They didn't talk a lot about representativeness in the focus groups. That wasn't a term that came out or even a concept that came out, but they did talk about the number of people, and they also talked about diversity. So there was a lot of discussion about how it was really important that surveys included a diverse set of respondents. Not necessarily that they reflected the population of interest, which is the way we as researchers would think about it, but in terms of diversity. Very few people mentioned the response rate or the sampling method. Nobody mentioned the result of the survey in the focus group. In the survey, reassuringly, this is being important, so the smaller the bar, the less important people said it was. Reassuringly, people said that whether the participant had a dog or the number of siblings a researcher had were not important in evaluating the survey, so they were paying attention to that. But they also said whether or not they agreed or disagreed with the results was not a big predictor. And so either people are not aware that that's biasing their processing, or they know that they shouldn't use that as part of their evaluation of surveys, and so they're not reporting that. So that kind of presents different results than some of the vignette research. And then the other factors associated with survey methodology, they all rated as fairly important. So then the next thing that we looked at is how do people use information about the survey to evaluate survey quality or accuracy. In the focus groups, we showed people a vignette with a mixture of high and low quality characteristics. So we had 2 different vignettes and we kind of crossed. So if the funder was high trust in one vignette, it was low trust in the other. We looked at how trustworthy the funder was, the data collection organization, the response rate, the sample size, and the sampling method. And then in the survey, we had 3 questions that asked people to rank methods, approaches from highest quality to lowest quality. And those focused on the survey funder, the survey data collection organization, and the sampling method. From the focus groups, what we found was that people generally could differentiate between higher and lower quality survey data collection organizations and sponsors, although people sometimes had different reactions to the same organization. Just anecdotally, one of the surveys was conducted by the Pew organization, and to me, the Pew Center is, a pretty valid organization. We had at least one, or a very trustworthy organization, and is respected sort of in the field of public opinion research, and we had at least one respondent who had some sort of very, had a very low opinion of that specific organization. People struggled a lot more with interpreting the meaning of numerical information in the survey descriptions. So the number of people surveyed or the response rate, what number was good or bad, was really hard for people to understand. So we had a survey where we said, okay, they did a survey with 5,000 people, and someone in the group would say, 5,000 people is really not that many, which 5,000 people is actually a lot for a national survey. So, we said, 20% of respondents participated. They didn't have a good benchmark to understand what that information meant. And again, when we were talking about the sampling method, they tended to emphasize diversity more than representativeness. So the idea of representativeness wasn't something that came up as much. So when we looked at the first survey, this is a question where they were asked to rank different survey funders. So they were asked to rank an advocacy group, a news media organization, a government organization, and a university researcher. And here, smaller bars mean higher ranking or more accuracy. So they ranked university researchers as the most accurate, government organizations as next most accurate, news media organizations, and then advocacy groups. This is not a great result for news media organizations. They were almost the same as advocacy groups. But then we had a question about survey data collection organizations, and they were asked to rank a professional survey organization, a news media organization, a group of students as a class project, and a government agency. And again, they did a pretty good job of ranking them in the same order that I think somebody who was a professional in the public opinion survey research field would. So they ranked the professional survey organization as the most accurate, the government agency next most accurate, and then again, a news media organization and a group of students were ranked fairly close together, right? So not helpful for that. This is actually really interesting in terms of, because news media organizations are one of the groups that's saying, like, why do people not understand surveys? How do we communicate to surveys accurately, accurately to people about surveys? And then the last ranking method had to do with the sampling method. So we had 4 different sampling methods. So people, and the words that are in brackets here were not shown to respondents. That's just to give you an idea. These are 4 of the most common sampling methods that are used in surveys. So people are selected from a group of volunteers who look like the U.S. population in terms of demographic characteristics, so quota sampling. People were selected through a random selection of U.S. Postal Service addresses, what's called address-based sampling, or ABS. People were invited to participate through online advertisements on a number of websites, often called river sampling, which is very commonly used by online non-probability panels. And people were selected through dialing of randomly selected telephone numbers, or RDD. So of these, ABS and RDD are probability sampling approaches. Quota and river sampling are not. And people's perception here was not as consistent with what I would say kind of a survey research expert would say. So they felt like quota sampling sounded like really good. And I think, again, this is this focus on diversity, right? So the quota sampling explanations said that they were selected from a group of volunteers who looked like the U.S. population in terms of demographic characteristics. So a group of volunteers, we selected people based on their characteristics. That's a quota sample. We know historically that doesn't necessarily always result accurate result. And then they did recognize that ADS sampling was the next most accurate, but then RDD and river sampling they thought were very inaccurate. So they recognized, they were right about some of these, but weren't as knowledgeable about others. So some of the optimistic conclusions here are that when asked, people give answers that suggest they know what factors are related to quality, right? So to some extent, people did give some answers that reflected sort of current conventional wisdom about what what experts would say are related to quality. And people in particular are relatively accurate at using organization as a heuristic for evaluating quality. On the pessimistic side, the self-report answers don't match behavior from vignette studies, so people either don't know or don't acknowledge that they're using the outcome of the survey to evaluate its accuracy. And people don't necessarily understand how to evaluate the more technical aspects of methodological information, which isn't really surprising, I think, but it does. We've had a lot of, I know that IPSI does some education and training, and one of the discussions that's happened in public opinion survey research circles is whether or not it would be useful to, or how one could develop a curriculum or a training program that would help high school and college teachers, for example, help people to understand things like representative sampling versus quota sampling, and to think about representativeness in sampling. So that's been something that has been on the radar for those groups for some time. So some of the limitations, we use convenient samples that we don't overcome in study 3 because we also use the convenient sample there. In study 2, we had some age limitations. I mentioned we didn't have anybody in the young age category, even though that was one of our explicit goals. And also one of the reasons why, if you notice, the field period for that study was really long because we kept trying different things to recruit younger MTurk participants. So for the third study, we used this larger sample size. We moved to using prolific, which enabled us to stratify by age. And there were a lot of advantages to using prolific. It was not a lot more expensive than MTurk. It turns out that, so there's a lot of alternatives to MTurk that are coming out that are really good. This study included vignettes and measures of attitudes and cognition and behavior, and it allowed us to do some additional analyses to examine how attitudes towards surveys and knowledge might influence attitudes and behavior. So the phase 3 survey had 1,852 prolific panel members. It was conducted between May 30th and June 9th, 2023. In case you don't know this, we were really busy during the year that we were doing this data collection. This is a lot of data collection and work to squeeze into a year. So we were collecting data right up until the last minute. We stratified by age, so half of the sample was 18 to 25, half was 26 and over, and we also stratified by gender. The questionnaire here, it took an average of 16.4 minutes to complete, and it included measures of attitude, so evaluations of surveys. In particular, we used the dilute method that I measured, the 9-item measure that I referenced earlier. We asked about behavior or experiences with surveys, and we also asked about a variety of different types of cognition, including beliefs about surveys and their accuracy, knowledge about surveys, and personal values. So there are two research questions I'm going to address with regard to this third study. The first is, to what extent are personal values associated with knowledge and opinions about public opinion surveys? And in this analysis, we used measures of survey-specific variables, so people's survey knowledge. We used I'll show you the questions here in a minute, but a series of 3 knowledge questions that were based on a previously developed scale of survey knowledge. Survey perceptions that were based on the 9-item dilute measure that I'll show you on the screen here in a minute. Past survey behavior. Then we measured personal values, civic engagement, and ideology. And then we measured demographics, gender, age, race, ethnicity, and education. The survey perceptions index included these 9 items. So about enjoying participating in surveys, how interesting they are, how important they are, how much can be learned, how often is completing a survey a waste of time, how many requests do you receive, how concerned are you about privacy, and how tiring it is to answer survey questions. And these items were all coded in the same direction, so higher values mean more positive evaluations of surveys, and average into an index, the alpha reliability coefficient for this 9-item index was 0.8. measuring the same underlying construct. The survey knowledge index asked these 4 questions. So one about whether or not when a survey was conducted, one about sampling, one about margin of error. So there were some knowledge questions. These are based on a series of items from Kuru et al. In 2017 paper. This scale did not have a very good reliability index. So its alpha was 0.23. So that suggests that people who got it was not the same people who were consistently getting these right? So a lot of people, the correctness of people's answers to these questions were not always highly correlated. We combined them into an index. This is actually the distribution of this survey knowledge scale. So it's pretty normally distributed, which, of those of us who are data analysts, this makes our heart warm because it's like but the alpha reliability coefficient, did not make me feel warm and fuzzy. Okay. So we combined them into a survey knowledge index. It may be that, but I can talk more about that if you have questions about it. But for the purposes of this, we ignore the fact that the alpha reliability index was not super great. We had a civic engagement index that we basically just asked people if they had participated in a series of behaviors in the past 12 months. This had an alpha reliability coefficient of 0.69, so acceptably high. And this was based on questions that are asked in the U.S. current population survey. And we had, these are the sample demographics, so gender, race, education, and ethnicity. So we started off using the demographics and then to predict ideology on the far right-hand side. I know we're going to go in the opposite direction from the way the columns are shown. And you can see what variables predicted ideology, and then moving to the left, the next column shows predicting civic engagement. And you can see that ideology is associated with civic engagement. The next column to the left is looking at survey knowledge. And you can see that ideology is associated with survey knowledge such that and ideology is coded, so higher values are more liberal. So liberals scored higher on the survey knowledge in measure than did conservatives. And that civic engagement predicted survey knowledge. So the more civically engaged people are, the more they knew about surveys. That's not surprising. And then we predicted survey perceptions with survey knowledge, civic engagement, ideology, and the demographics. Now here, interestingly, so ideology wasn't associated with survey perceptions. Civic engagement resulted in more positive survey perceptions. So people who are civically engaged had more positive evaluations of surveys. Interestingly, people who knew more about surveys had less positive evaluations of surveys. So maybe because they're aware of they're aware of instances where people say that they're doing a survey and they're not, or they're more aware of lower quality survey, or they're just aware of what factors influence surveys in general. So this is sort of the relationship between the core 4 variables that we started with: civic engagement, ideology, survey perceptions, and survey knowledge. This is a much more complicated diagram of all of the significant relationships among these variables. And then we also had a question that asked about past survey participation. So thinking about the last public opinion survey you were asked to participate in, did you agree to participate or did you not agree to participate? And that was also positively predicted by civic engagement and survey perceptions, but not survey knowledge. So the next question and the last question that I'll talk about today was, what influences how people evaluate the survey, the accuracy of a specific survey when it's described? And this is the vignette portion of study 3. Is it characteristics of the description of the survey, so the methodological quality, whether or not the survey results agree with the person's own opinion on an issue or not, whether or not the person has been told in advance they would be asked to evaluate accuracy. So one thing we were interested in is, if you tell people, I'm going to ask you later about the survey's accuracy, do they pay more attention to the methodological information in the vignette? And the order in which information is presented. And so we rotated that partially because some of our past work suggests that that can impact how people evaluate surveys. And then we also looked at individual characteristics like knowledge about surveys, attitudes or perceptions of surveys, political knowledge, and education. Actually, I'm sorry, we didn't look at political knowledge. I don't know why that's on the slides, but okay. So those are things that I already talked about how we measured in the previous section. The vignette design, and I'm going to try to do this quickly and we can come back and talk more about it if people have questions, was fairly complicated, and we had 2 respondent level factors. So we had an instructions manipulation. Some people were told, in the next section of the study, you're going to read about several hypothetical public opinion surveys. Other people were told, in the next section of the study, you're going to read about several hypothetical public opinion surveys. After each survey, you'll be asked to rate how accurate the survey is. Not to foreshadow, but that didn't have any impact on people's evaluation. So telling them, hey, we're going to ask you about accuracy did not really affect the results. And then we rotated the order of information in the vignette. Some people were told about the methods of the survey and then the results, and other people were told about the results and then the methods. Each respondent received 3 vignettes. Each respondent received 1 vignette about abortion, 1 about where the survey topic was about abortion, 1 where it was about gun control, and 1 about police funding. Each respondent received 1 vignette where the survey quality was generally low, and that was described in several methodological features, 1 where it was medium and 1 where it was high. And they read about 1 survey where the result of the survey was consistent with more liberal perspective, 1 where it was consistent with more conservative, and 1 where there was no result available. When you rotate all of this, and when you randomize all of this, and you also randomize the order of it, there's something like 216 different possible combinations of this. So the research assistant for this project also really earned her money by creating possibly the most complicated Qualtrics instrument ever in the history of UIC. So this was the details of the vignette design in terms of the topic, how the methodological quality was manipulated, and the results for each of those 3 issues. And I can come back to this slide later. There's a lot of information on here, but I can come back if people want to look at it more carefully. So after each vignette, we said, how accurate or inaccurate do you think findings from the survey are? Would you say very accurate, somewhat accurate, a little inaccurate, somewhat inaccurate, or very inaccurate? And I have that question bolded because that's what I'm going to focus on here. We also asked people, why did you give this rating of the survey's accuracy? And we have open-ended responses that we haven't finished analyzing. And we also asked, how would you rate the methodology of the survey you read about, which we haven't analyzed as much either. So in addition to that, we asked about respondents' own opinions about legalized abortion, gun control, and police funding at the very end of the survey. So the vignettes were at the beginning, there were a bunch of questions in the middle, and then 15 minutes later, we asked them 3 questions about their opinions about those 3 issues. And those questions were designed to assess whether the result of the survey was consistent or inconsistent with their own opinion. We also included the survey perceptions index from before, the survey knowledge, and then we controlled for some demographic variables. So the analysis approach here, the data is organized in a long form, if anybody is really into data analysis, where there are essentially 3 rows of data for each respondent, 1 for each vignette. And we use the mixed command in SPSS to control for clustering at the respondent level. So essentially, we included each of the 3 vignettes as a separate data point in the data file. So these are the initial results looking at main effects of these variables on predicting survey accuracy. So not surprisingly, match with own attitude was a significant predictor. So the more consistent that the result of the survey was with your own attitude, the more accurate you thought it was. Survey quality was also a significant predictor. So the higher the survey quality, the more accurate that you thought it was. Other things, like going down here, so interestingly, knowledge about surveys and perceptions of surveys were not at all associated with how accurate you thought that specific survey was. So this was consistent with a lot of past research that's shown that your match with your own attitude and can impact, and survey quality can also impact people's perceptions of accuracy. We were also interested in whether or not other variables in this model moderated the impact of quality and match with your own attitude. So we looked at interactions between other variables in the model and the effect of quality and a match between the respondent's attitude and the survey result. So I'm going to walk through each of these a little bit and say, so survey knowledge moderated the effect of quality, but not the effect of attitude or result of the match. And I'm going to pause on this slide for a minute and just talk about what this means. So the red bars are the impact of quality. So this is essentially it's not the mean level of accuracy, it's the effect that quality has. So what you can see is as survey knowledge increases, the impact of quality also increases. So that actually tells us that people who are more knowledgeable about surveys are more likely to use the quality of the survey to evaluate its accuracy. That's sort of not surprising, right? So people who know more about surveys, this actually provides a lot of validation for those of you who were skeptical about the alpha reliability coefficient of 0.23 or whatever. So that this is actually measuring something meaningful, right? Survey knowledge. Match with the survey result with the respondent's own attitude didn't vary across survey knowledge. Then we looked at respondent educational attainment. And respondent educational attainment moderated the effect of quality on accuracy ratings, but again, did not moderate the effect of the attitude result match. So again, same kind of finding where respondents who had a 4-year college degree or an advanced degree were more likely to use the quality of the survey in the vignette to evaluate its accuracy, whereas respondents with a high school degree or less, or some college, were less likely to do so. And education didn't affect the impact of the match of the survey result with the respondent's own attitude. It looks like it might have, because it looks like it kind of went down over time, but that was not a significant effect. Interestingly, the vignette position moderated the effect of both quality and the result respondent match. So here, so the vignette position, 1 is the first vignette that the respondent saw, 2 is the second, and 3 is the third that the respondent saw. And as a reminder, the topic of that vignette, the position that was reported, all of those things are randomized across order. That's why we had 216 different conditions. And so what this tells you is that maybe because people were being asked about the accuracy each time, as they went through the vignettes, they were paying more attention to the quality of the methods that were reported in the vignette, and they were using them more to evaluate the accuracy. So they were learning over the course of the vignette that they should be paying attention to methodological factors. Interestingly, the match of the survey result with the respondent's attitude showed the opposite pattern. So people were most likely to use that in the first vignette, and then they stopped using it as much after they learned about more survey results and were asked about accuracy. So to me, this is kind of interesting because it suggests a learning effect, right? And it suggests that you could train people to pay attention to quality and not pay attention to their own attitude. So I don't know, maybe I'm just an optimist, but I think that makes me feel a little more positive. Okay. The order of the information in the vignette moderated the effect of quality and the match of survey respondents, and such that the information that was presented last had more impact. So if the results were presented before the methods, quality had more impact than if the methods were presented before the results, and the opposite was true for the match of the survey result with respondents' attitude. This is a little harder to interpret. I mean, it suggests that the last thing that people read was the most impactful, and that's maybe not surprising. There is some literature that suggests that when you read a list of pieces of information that people infer that the last piece is the most important. So that's not inconsistent with some of the literature. Again, we rotated the order because we wanted to go for that. And then this is the last graph I'll show, which shows that political ideology moderated the effect of quality and the match of survey result and the respondent's attitude. This is a little harder, I think, to detect what the effect is, but it looks like extremely liberal respondents, in particular, seem to use both quality and the match with their own attitude to evaluate the accuracy of the survey. So it's not as clear, I think, an effect as some of the other effects. And we didn't really have a strong expectation about this. So what are some conclusions for this? Well, survey quality and the match of the result of the survey with your own attitude are the two biggest main effect predictors of accuracy rating. So we also found that, right? So that matches up with past research. Most other variables don't directly predict perceptions of accuracy, but factors like survey knowledge, education, characteristics of the vignette, and political ideology may moderate the impact of quality, and some also may moderate the match of the results of the survey with your own attitude. So what are some overall conclusions? Well, people are able to successfully use some methodological information, but they don't have a good understanding of some other aspects of survey methodology. Some people do use methodological quality in some cases to evaluate the results of surveys. And there are both benefits and costs of survey knowledge. So we might think, oh, if we just get people to be more knowledgeable about surveys, that would be great. But in fact, people who are more knowledgeable about surveys were actually less positive about surveys, right, if you remember. But they were better at using methodological information to evaluate the accuracy of surveys. So they maybe would be better at making decisions about which surveys to participate and not participate in based on their quality. All right. So limitations, again, we have a non-representative sample. Another limitation is that the vignettes were first in study 3, so all the other measures were measured after they had already read those vignettes. We had a long and very heated discussion about how to order things in the survey. And the reason we put the vignettes at the beginning was because we really wanted people to be fresh when they read those, because it was a several sentences that they had to read before they then evaluated the vignette. And we didn't want them to have participated in 12 minutes of survey and then have to read vignettes and evaluate them. So we kind of prioritized the vignettes over some of the other measures. And so that's a little bit of a limitation. It would have been nice to have collected these data at 2 different points in time, so respondents didn't realize that they were kind of part of the same research. So the future of this research, we're going to continue to analyze these data. I mentioned we have open-ended responses to the question, why did you give that accuracy rating? And we're interested to see what those look like. We also have some measures in study 3 that relate to how public opinion surveys should be used by policymakers, and we want to build that variable into our analyses in the model. One of the things I think is the most interesting here is the potential for developing educational materials or an intervention to help increase people's positivity towards surveys, but more importantly maybe to increase their ability to and their attention to quality indicators and also their ability to understand what those quality indicators mean. A potential future direction is to replicate the results with a representative sample of Americans. There's a program called the TEST, or the Time Sharing Experiments for the Social Sciences. I don't know, is anybody familiar with that? It's an NSF-funded project where you can submit a proposal for an experiment, and they don't give you money, but they collect data for you, right? So you have to write a proposal and say, I want to use this number of questions, these are the people, and it's designed to make a representative sample survey more accessible to more researchers. And so that's a direction that we're thinking of going, is writing a proposal to test. And then the last thing is about the impact of survey modes. Some of the previous work that we've done used telephone surveys. This was a web survey, and there's a lot of factors related to processing of information that are influenced by whether the information is presented orally or visually, right? So visual information, you can kind of take your time and think about it. You can go back and look at previous information. Whereas something's presented orally over the telephone, once the information has been presented, you can't go back and sort of retrieve that. And I think that's particularly interesting in thinking about how results of surveys are presented by the media, right? Because we certainly have cases where results of surveys are presented orally, and we have cases where they're presented visually in a written format. And so thinking about whether or not that's an important variable in how people process information. So that's all I have. Thank you.